I've had the most amazing week in preparing this Liszt piece. This was the first Liszt that I heard as a child, and I remember the visceral response that I had, both physically as well as musically in my body. I didn't have the emotional maturity or the vocabulary then to respond outwardly with what I was feeling. But it stuck with me as such a strong response that I never studied or learned this piece before. I worked on many other Liszt pieces or ones of this style, and some of the other Petrarch sonnets, but not this one. So I finally decided that after this year of quarantine, as we're celebrating 1 year of solitude, that it was time to bring this out and to delve deep into this world of contrasts and emotional upheaval. The piece is very famous, and Liszt is very well known, as he should be, as this sort of cult of personality and insanely talented virtuoso pianist, sort of teetering on this romantic ideal or edge between madness and genius. If you think of the inspiration of Paganini, or the deft handling of the subject by Thomas Mann in his novel Dr. Faustus, thinking about selling one's soul for the mastery of their art. But there is so much more in Liszt's musical mind, in his interpretation and skills and innovations as a composer that's very well represented in this piece. So what I want to share with you are two things that were sort of on the back of my mind, inspiring my imagination and guiding me through the approach of this piece some decades after my initial hearing as a child. The first, of course, is the text by Petrarch, as well as Liszt's own vocal setting of the text, and secondly, a sort of long description of Liszt's own playing by his pupil. The challenge when approaching a piece that is so well known, or a piece that I have heard so many times by student pianists or by accomplished artists, is that it's difficult to separate what we're seeing on the page in the musical text by sort of mountain of years, or in this case, century and more, of artistic interpretations and traditions that have attached themselves to the piece, which is a beautiful legacy. But I kind of wanted to set as much of that aside as I could to delve into the poetry, into Liszt's setting, and also into what I could think of as Liszt's own approach musically. So if we are to look at the sonnet by Petrarch, Petrarch was a 14th century Italian poet and priest, as well as being considered perhaps the world's first tourist. He traveled often simply for pleasure, which was quite a feat if you think about how difficult and laborious travel must have been, and uncomfortable, or even dangerous it must have been in the 14th century. Petrarch was first a priest, though later he left monastic orders, mainly because of his long passion for whom he titled Laura, and who is the inspiration for this poem. It is a poem of intense contrasts, and there exists many wonderful English translations, but one of my favorites is the first English translation from the 1500s. I find no peace, and all my war is done. I fear and hope. I burn and freeze like ice. I fly above the wind, yet cannot rise, and naught I have, yet all the world I season. That looseth nor lacketh holdeth me in prison, and holdeth me not, yet can I escape no wise, nor lets me leave nor die at my device, and yet of death it giveth none occasion. Without eye I see, and without tongue I plain. I desire to perish, yet ask I health. I love another, and yet I hate myself. I feed in sorrow, and laugh in all my pain. Likewise pleaseth me both death and life, and my delight is cause of my grief. I have included below another more modern translation, which I also consulted, and perhaps gives a little bit more careful translation, or more educated translation, than this 16th century poet did. But I find this one to be very evocative in the imagery and in the cadences of the poem. The second thing that I really immersed myself in was this contemporary account by one of Liszt's own students of his playing. So we know from reading about him, and mainly reading about this Lisztomania, which the poet and writer Heinrich Heine coined after hearing one of his concerts, that there was an incredible cult of personality and sort of mystical ecstasy which surrounded Liszt's concerts and his performing, which he retired from at the age of 35 after a period about 1,000 concerts in 8 years, traveling throughout Europe, which is an incredible feat for the time, both in musical stamina as well as just simple musical artistry. It's difficult always searching for the truth, but in this quote, I think there is a lot of core about the true honesty of his musical artistry, as well as his search for real human emotion and wanting to understand the psychology behind what moves us as a person and as an artistic or a musical soul, which kind of flies in the face of some of the cultish thoughts about him, but exposes him more as a real person and a very self-educated individual who was searching after as much knowledge as he could find. Monsieur Liszt's playing contains abandonment, a liberated feeling, but even when it becomes impetuous and energetic in his fortissimo, it is still without harshness and dryness. He draws from the piano tones that are pure, mellower, and stronger than anyone has been able to do. His touch has an indescribable charm. He is the enemy of affected, stilted, contorted expressions. Most of all, he wants truth in musical sentiment, and so he makes a psychological study of his emotions to convey them as they are. Thus, a strong expression is often followed by a sense of fatigue and dejection, a kind of coldness, because this is the way nature works. I found in applying some of these thoughts to this Petrarch setting very interesting this last sentence, because throughout the piece, Liszt keep introducing new musical stanzas, and almost all of them, he inserts forte, forte, forte in the beginning. Even though some are cantabile, some are stringendo, some are dolente, it's still forte. But at the end of each one is a ritenuto or a diminuendo, just like he says, this outburst of passion and then the sort of slackening of the musical fatigue before the passion or the contrast, this friction of the poetry begins again. So without further ado, Liszt's piano setting of the Sonnet 104 by Petrarch. I hope you enjoy.